Scene 1 of a lesbian study frames desire not as spectacle but as inquiry, using Joyce's academic project as a metaphor for the careful, often over-intellectualized way many women are taught to approach their own feelings, especially when those feelings fall outside what has been sanctioned as acceptable or safe. Joyce begins the film firmly rooted in structure, responsibility, and distance, writing about the lesbian life as if it were something external to her rather than something she might already be brushing up against internally. And her decision to share a home with Paula is motivated as much by practicality as by curiosity. Paula's entrance immediately disrupts Joyce's carefully ordered world, embodying a form of queerness that is unapologetic, messy, and resistant to academic categorization. And for many queer viewers, this contrast feels deeply familiar, echoing the divide between those who learn to survive by blending in and those who learn to survive by standing out. Paula calling herself a lesbian legend may sound flippant, but symbolically she represents lived experience over theory, the kind of embodied knowledge that cannot be footnoted or neatly summarized. And Joyce's impatience with Paula's unreliability reflects a broader cultural discomfort with queerness that refuses productivity, punctuality, or respectability. Joyce wants interviews, citations, and authority figures, not chaos, because structure offers her emotional distance from what she is studying, and that distance feels protective. When Joyce finally arranges an interview with Lisa, a prominent lesbian in town, the narrative shifts from domestic friction to anticipatory tension, signaling that Joyce is about to encounter queerness not as an abstract subject, but as a living presence that sees her back. The walk up to Lisa's home is imbued with a charged stillness, the sense that something internal is about to be named whether Joyce is ready or not, and this moment resonates strongly with lesbian audiences who remember the first time curiosity tipped into recognition. Lisa's calm confidence and attentive gaze immediately reverse the expected power dynamic of interviewer and subject, positioning Joyce not as an observer, but as someone being gently, deliberately perceived. Joyce's instinctive response is to retreat into tools of distance, reaching for her pen and paper, clinging to professionalism as a shield, a gesture many women recognize as the reflex to intellectualize desire before it can be felt. Lisa's laughter and redirection are significant not because they override Joyce's agency, but because they interrupt the lie that this encounter can remain purely academic. Guiding Joyce's hand away from her notes is a symbolic invitation to be present rather than protected, to experience rather than document, and the moment challenges society's discomfort with women expressing desire for each other by treating that desire as neither dangerous nor shameful, but simply honest. Joyce's surprise when Lisa leans in is not framed as fear, but as the shock of recognition, the realization that what she has been studying from a distance has been living inside her all along. Lisa's question, "This is what you want, isn't it?" is crucial in its directness, modeling consent through clarity rather than assumption, and Joyce's nod carries the weight of years of unspoken longing finally finding language without words. For queer women watching, this scene mirrors the experience of having desire articulated by someone else before one has learned to articulate it oneself, and the relief and vulnerability that can accompany that moment. Society's discomfort with women loving women persists precisely because scenes like this refuse to frame desire as either predatory or performative. Instead, they show it emerging through attentiveness, mutual recognition, and emotional honesty, which destabilizes narratives that rely on denial or caricature. Lisa represents the role of the woman who has already crossed the threshold Joyce is standing before. Someone comfortable enough in herself to invite without coercing, to wait without withdrawing, while Joyce embodies the woman still negotiating permission to want. Paula's earlier presence lingers in the background as another mirror, reminding viewers that there are many ways to live queerness, none of them fully contained by academic frameworks or social approval. For women more broadly, this scene speaks to the tension between responsibility and authenticity, the fear that stepping into desire means abandoning control or betraying the version of oneself that has been rewarded. Joyce's journey in this moment is not about abandoning intellect, but about integrating it with feeling, recognizing that knowledge without embodiment can become a form of avoidance. By centering Joyce's interior experience and framing the kiss as an outcome of consent and curiosity rather than conquest, the lesbian study challenges audiences to reconsider why women's desire still feels transgressive when expressed plainly. The scene affirms that becoming visible often begins not with declaration, but with acknowledgement, the quiet courage of nodding yes to what has always been there. And for LGBTQ+ viewers seeking authenticity, it offers a reflection of the moment when study gives way to self-recognition, and life can no longer be kept at arm's length. Scene 2 of a lesbian study captures the moment when curiosity transforms into immersion, when Joyce's careful intellectual distance finally gives way to lived experience, and the film uses this shift to explore how queer understanding often arrives not through data but through proximity, trust, and emotional exposure. Joyce typing feverishly at her laptop signals urgency and awakening rather than academic rigor. Her words tumbling out as she struggles to reconcile what she has learned from Lisa with the framework of her research. And this tension resonates with many queer women who discover that self-knowledge cannot always be neatly translated into acceptable language. Her admission that Lisa's stories of love and loss were life-changing underscores how queer histories are often transmitted orally and relationally, rather than institutionally, passed from woman to woman because formal archives have ignored or erased them. Joyce's uncertainty about how much she can use reflects a deeper question about legitimacy. Which parts of queer life are allowed to be recorded, and which are only permitted to be felt? The interruption of Paula's alarm clock grounds Joyce back in the domestic, reminding viewers that intellectual transformation does not occur in isolation, but alongside relationships that challenge, frustrate, and sustain us. Joyce's evolving bond with Paula becomes a parallel education, one rooted not in desire but in companionship, and her realization that Paula has taught her about friendship rather than sex highlights, an often overlooked truth in queer narratives, that intimacy between women is multifaceted, and that friendship can be as formative as romance. The idea that they could be best friends forever carries a hopeful naivety, reflecting Joyce's longing for stability and continuity in a world that has suddenly expanded beyond her expectations. Paula's decision to ghost Joyce before the meeting with the real lesbian couple introduces disappointment, without villainizing her, illustrating how unreliability can coexist with affection, especially in communities where marginalization has shaped survival strategies that do not always prioritize punctuality or consistency. For many queer viewers, this moment is painfully familiar, evoking the experience of placing trust in someone who operates by different rhythms and values, and the sting of realizing that care does not always translate into follow-through. Joyce's choice to attend the meeting alone is quietly courageous, signaling her growing willingness to step into queer spaces without a buffer, even when it feels uncomfortable or unplanned. Meeting Katie and Eva marks a turning point where Joyce encounters lesbian love not as legend or authority, but as everyday partnership, and their kindness and openness challenge the notion that queer intimacy must be guarded or performative. The women sharing how they met and what feels good to them is framed not as exposure but as generosity, an act of trust that reflects the communal impulse to make queer life legible to those still finding their way. Joyce's breathless reaction as she watches them kiss is not voyeuristic but reverent, capturing the awe of witnessing tenderness between women without shame or apology. And this moment resonates deeply with lesbian audiences who remember the first time they saw their own desires reflected peacefully in others. Joyce's acknowledgement that this was not the research she was looking for, but what she needed, speaks to the gap between academic inquiry and embodied truth, and to the way society often pressures women to justify desire through purpose rather than pleasure. The whirlwind of sensations Joyce describes is less about arousal than recognition, the feeling of alignment when internal questions find external affirmation. Society's discomfort with women expressing love for each other is challenged here by the ordinariness of the scene, by the fact that Katie and Eva's affection is neither hidden nor dramatized, simply lived, and that discomfort persists because such normalcy undermines narratives that frame queer love as fringe or disruptive. Joyce stands at the intersection of observer and participant, learning that understanding does not diminish professionalism but deepens humanity, and this lesson mirrors the real-world journey many queer women undertake as they move from theory to self-acceptance. Paula's absence lingers symbolically, reminding viewers that not all guides stay for the whole journey, and that growth often involves navigating disappointment without losing openness. For women more broadly, the scene speaks to the courage required to enter spaces alone, to listen without judgment, and to allow oneself to be changed by others' honesty. By centering Joyce's interior response and refusing sensational framing, the lesbian study affirms that becoming visible is not about crossing a single threshold, but about accumulating moments of recognition, each one loosening the grip of repression. The scene closes with Joyce on cloud 9, not because she has found answers, but because she has found permission to feel. And for LGBTQ POES audiences seeking authenticity, this portrayal honors the quiet exhilaration of realizing that what one has been studying from afar is, at last, allowed to belong to oneself. Scene 3 of A Lesbian Study marks the moment where Joyce's careful intellectual distance finally collapses under the weight of feeling, and the film treats this collapse not as scandal but as recognition, tracing how queer love often announces itself quietly through jealousy, disappointment, and longing, long before it is ever named. Joyce's frustration at Paula's absence from the previous interview is not merely academic irritation, but the hurt of someone whose emotional investment is no longer abstract, and Paula's chaotic entrance, still wearing the residue of another life, another night, immediately exposes the imbalance between them. Paula's excitement about her impulsive adventure is not malicious, but it is revealing, embodying a freedom Joyce both admires and fears, while Joyce's crossed arms and muted responses illustrate a familiar queer defense mechanism. masking vulnerability as annoyance to avoid revealing how deeply one cares. Paula's casual recounting of kissing a stranger lands heavily not because it is shocking, but because it clarifies something Joyce has been trying to avoid, that her feelings have shifted from curiosity to attachment, and that this attachment exists without any guarantee of reciprocity. The tension over rent further grounds the scene in realism, reminding viewers that emotional intimacy between women often unfolds alongside practical strain, where one partner's instability becomes another's quiet burden, a dynamic many queer women recognize from relationships shaped by uneven resources and expectations. Joyce's polite agreement to meet Jenny despite Paula's unreliability signals a turning point, her willingness to step into queer spaces without Paula as intermediary. And when Jenny arrives, Joyce's immediate attraction is framed not as desire overtaking reason, but as the shock of being seen by someone who inhabits queerness with ease. Jenny's guardedness contrasts with the openness of previous interviewees, challenging Joyce's assumption that queer women owe transparency simply because their lives are marginalized. And this moment introduces an important ethical tension about access, consent, and the limits of research. Jenny's explanation of her open relationship with Maya is delivered without defensiveness, modeling a form of honesty that does not require justification. And her revelation that she once dated Paula gently collapses Joyce's internal narrative, connecting her personal longing to a broader web of queer community where histories overlap and attachments are rarely isolated. For lesbian audiences, this acknowledgement resonates deeply, reflecting the smallness of queer worlds and the emotional resilience required to navigate them without shame or possessiveness. Jenny's assertion that jealousy cannot dominate an open relationship is not presented as prescription, but as lived truth, inviting Joyce to consider relational models that challenge the scarcity mindset often imposed on queer women, especially those from more conservative backgrounds. As the evening deepens and Jenny recognizes Joyce's feelings for Paula, the scene shifts from interview to intervention, and Joyce's attempt to downplay her emotions feels achingly familiar, echoing how many women minimize desire until someone else names it aloud. Staying the night is framed as hospitality rather than temptation, reinforcing the film's commitment to emotional grounding. And later, when Joyce becomes aware of Jenny and Maya's closeness, the moment is handled with restraint, focusing on Joyce's internal response rather than external action. Listening from another room, Joyce is confronted not with explicit imagery, but with the undeniable reality of women loving each other openly and without apology. And this becomes a mirror rather than a spectacle, forcing her to confront the truth she has been circling. Her realization that she is in love with Paula arrives not through physical transgression, but through emotional clarity, underscoring how desire often crystallizes in moments of witnessing rather than participation. Society's discomfort with women expressing love for each other is quietly challenged here by the ordinariness of Jenny and Maya's relationship, which exists without secrecy or shame, and by Joyce's internal struggle, which reveals how deeply external norms shape self-perception. This discomfort persists because women's love for women destabilizes narratives that frame intimacy as either proprietary or invisible, and the film resists both by centering choice, honesty, and interior truth. Each woman in the scene occupies a symbolic role. Paula represents freedom without accountability, Jenny represents clarity without intrusion, Maya embodies stability within unconventional structures, and Joyce stands at the threshold between observation and embodiment. For women broadly, the scene speaks to the universal experience of realizing one's feelings too late to control them, and the vulnerability of loving someone who may not love back in the same way. By allowing Joyce's realization to emerge without punishment or spectacle, the lesbian study affirms that becoming visible is not about acting on every feeling, but about finally acknowledging them. And for LGBTQ+ audiences seeking authenticity, this moment honors the quiet, often solitary reckoning that marks the transition from studying desire to accepting it as one's own. Scene 4 of The Lesbian Study brings Joyce's arc to its emotional convergence, transforming months of observation, restraint, and quiet ache into a moment of honest confrontation that feels both intimate and deeply recognizable to queer audiences, especially women who have learned to translate longing into patience rather than permission. Joyce, lying alone on her bed, reflecting on the distance between her small-town past and her expanding inner life, captures a familiar queer reckoning, the realization that identity is not discovered all at once, but assembled through experiences that gently, and sometimes painfully, undo what once felt certain. Her questions are not just about sexuality, but about worth and visibility, about why she has changed and why that change feels tethered to Paula, a woman who has occupied her thoughts while seemingly remaining just out of reach. Joyce's fixation is not framed as obsession, but as the emotional consequence of intimacy without acknowledgement, a dynamic many queer women recognize when affection grows in silence, while the world offers no clear script for naming it. Paula's return interrupts Joyce's inward spiral, and the confrontation that follows is notable for its vulnerability rather than drama, beginning with Joyce's tentative question, "Is there something wrong with me?" A line that echoes the internalized doubt so many women carry when affection is not returned in expected ways. Paula's immediate reassurance is tender but insufficient, and Joyce's need to search Paula's eyes for truth underscores how words alone cannot heal wounds created by absence and inconsistency. When Joyce finally voices the pain of always feeling secondary, of being someone Paula cared for but never prioritized, the moment resonates as an articulation of emotional neglect rather than accusation, and her tears reveal how deeply she has been trying to remain composed for someone else's comfort. Joyce's outburst, sharp and regretful the moment it leaves her mouth, reflects the collision of jealousy and shame that often surfaces when women have been taught to suppress desire until it erupts in self-reproach. Paula's shock is not anger but recognition, the sudden clarity that her avoidance has been a form of protection not from Joyce but from herself, a defense against the vulnerability of caring deeply for someone who sees through her carefully cultivated nonchalance. This realization reframes Paula's earlier behavior not as indifference but as fear, a fear many queer women know intimately. The fear that acknowledging love will demand change, accountability, or loss of freedom. Their shared silence before the kiss is where the scene's power truly lies, a pause heavy with all that has gone unsaid. And the kiss itself is framed not as culmination, but as permission, an agreement to stop pretending that connection has not already been shaping them. For lesbian and broader LGBTQ+ audiences, this moment reflects the relief of mutual recognition, when desire is finally met with courage rather than deflection, and when the risk of honesty feels preferable to the ache of restraint. Society's discomfort with women expressing love for each other is gently challenged here by the ordinariness of the exchange, by the fact that this love emerges through conversation, tears, and accountability rather than spectacle, reminding viewers that queer intimacy does not require excess to be meaningful. The aftermath, conveyed through Joyce's return to her laptop, reframes stability not as stagnation but as shared effort, acknowledging that perfection is not the absence of flaws but the willingness to wake up beside someone and keep choosing one another. Joyce's narration about extensions, transfers, and mournings together grounds the romance in practical adaptation, reflecting how queer women often must restructure their lives to make room for authenticity, negotiating institutions that rarely anticipate their needs. Paula's lingering difficulty with mournings becomes a symbol of continuity rather than conflict, a reminder that love does not erase difference but learns to live with it. For women more broadly, this scene speaks to the courage required to name desire without guarantee, to confront someone not with demands but with truth, and to accept that love often arrives only after discomfort has been allowed to surface. Joyce embodies the woman who learns that self-discovery is inseparable from emotional risk, while Paula represents the woman who learns that freedom without intimacy can become its own form of isolation. Together, they illustrate how queer love often requires unlearning habits of avoidance and self-minimization shaped by a world that has not always welcomed it. By ending the scene in reflective calm rather than heightened drama, the lesbian study affirms that becoming visible does not always feel explosive. Sometimes it feels like exhaling, like choosing to stay. And for audiences seeking authenticity, this moment offers a truthful, compassionate portrait of two women finally allowing themselves to be seen by each other.